in Christ who makes us clean. Amen. Amen. So on the surface of things, we have two stories today, and one might say it is the story of the bad leper and the good leper. Leprosy in biblical times was any disease that compromised the integrity of the skin. And so even eczema, which I'm a frequent victim of, would cause one to be unclean, so that one needed to be separated from the rest of the community until such time as that disease had become mended, and then the priest would see you and declare you to be healed if you were so healed. And then you could be restored to the community. So it was a dreadful thing to have a skin disease. Even something as, relatively something not life-threatening like eczema could completely destroy your reputation, your relationship with the community, all sorts of things. There was so much fear and ignorance around disease that compromised the skin. So the story starts with, the first story starts with this great and mighty, actually Syrian, Aram is Syria, Syrian general who is suffering from leprosy. And in order to get healed, he brings all his military might and the power of his nation behind him, and they bring these gifts to the king of Israel. But of course the gifts come with the threat behind them, right? This little weeny vassal state of Israel is living in terror in the shadow of the great Syrian army. So the message is not lost on the king of Israel when this Syrian general shows up with all of his gifts, and he tears his clothes. He says, "I can't do anything about this," and it's really actually quite a wonderful comic narrative if you pull it all apart, but I don't want to spend that much time on it. But the king of Israel winds up getting this guy to go see Elisha, the prophet. So this time, Naaman rides up to Elisha's house, and you notice he still has the chariots and the horses, but he doesn't have the gold and the silver and the clothes and all that. That went to the king of Israel. We forget about the carrot now. We are coming with just the stick. And they ride up to the house, and the prophet comes out and prostrates himself before this great and mighty king and says, "Oh, please don't hurt me." No. He doesn't even come out of his house. He sends a messenger. This is like major insult, okay? Major insult. This man has already lowered himself to come to the prophet's home. And the prophet doesn't even invite him in for tea. Doesn't even send a bottle of water out to this distinguished guest. Just sends a messenger to come out and talk to him. And the messenger says, "Well, my master says," can you imagine, wouldn't you love to be the messenger? That was what Jesus said. Wouldn't you love to be that guy? My master says, "Go wash in the Jordan 7 times and everything will be great." And the bad leper, in his pride, says, "Well, aren't the rivers in Syria just as good? I would expect this guy to come out and bow and scrape up what's going on here. I'm going home. I don't want anything." And this is going to be bad news for Israel, because on his way home he's going to do some damage, right? And his servants, very interesting how the servants are the messengers in this story. The servants talk about it and they say, "Look, it's not that hard to do. What have you got to lose? We won't tell anybody you did it. Just go down and do what the guy says and see if it works." And lo and behold, it does. So the bad leper gets cleansed. In our gospel story today, in contrast. The leper is just your average Joe leper. He's not any great important person. So he comes on his knees to Jesus, begging, okay? He's placed himself in that place of subservient relationship to Jesus. And he begs Jesus. And the scripture, you know, Mark is a very terse writer. He rarely includes much dialogue. He's very shy about using adjectives. So when Mark bothers to say things in a narrative like this, you really need to pay attention to what Mark says. So he comes kneeling to Jesus, and it says, Jesus, moved with pity, reaches out his hand, says, I do wish to heal you, be made clean, and he reaches out his hand and touches him. Okay, there's a lot going on in that. One thing, he's touching an unclean person, and uncleanliness is extremely infectious. Whether or not leprosy or whatever skin disease this man had was infectious, uncleanness is absolutely infectious. If a clean person touches an unclean person, they've been rendered unclean. A healer doesn't normally do that. And here the contrast between Jesus, who actually touches this guy, and Elisha, who doesn't even come out of the house. So Jesus' sense of compassion is very obvious. And though many of the texts say pity, I don't think most of us want pity. Pity does imply that one-down relationship, doesn't it? Compassion is more like, you know, side by side. I understand what you're going through. We're like one another, and I can help you now, and you'll help me later. You know, that's what compassion is like. But pity is like, you poor little thing. Interestingly, this passage is translated also as Jesus filled with anger. Filled with anger, not pity, anger. And as often happens with these translations, I think, people said anger? Oh no, Jesus is not angry. We don't like that idea. How could Jesus be angry? What would he be angry about? They must have meant pity. So they translated pity. I mean, there's a good argument for saying that the text says anger. A very good argument for it. I'm not a Greek scholar, so I won't argue it from that point of view, but I will argue it from the context. Because for one thing, pity doesn't ring right with me, for the reasons I just explained. But the other thing is what happens in the rest of the story. What would Jesus have been angry about? The leper comes on his knees, begging. Shouldn't Jesus be delighted that this guy has shown the proper humility, since Naaman is the bad leper who comes full of pride? Isn't this the right way to come and ask for healing, on your knees, begging? Well, what if it isn't? What if that isn't the right way to come asking for healing? What if what makes Jesus angry is the whole religious system that puts this man in this position in the first place? That he feels that the only way he can get help is to, on his knees, beg. What if that's what he's mad at? Not the leper, but a world in which that is the case. And so Jesus doesn't just wave his hand and say, be clean. Instead, just to show him, he reaches out and touches the man and says, I do want to heal you. Be clean. And the guy is. And then he becomes a really bad leper. He gets up and instead of doing what Jesus says, okay, now, you better go to the religious authorities first. Don't tell anybody about this. Go straight to the religious authorities and let them check you out and make sure that it's all, within the framework that everybody expects, and then you'll be okay with everyone else. This guy's going, yeah, I'm clean. I don't need those jerks. I am done with that. I am done with keeping secrets. I am done with feeling ashamed. I'm not ashamed of anything anymore. I'm going to tell everybody I know. And that's what he does. Instead of keeping it quiet, he goes out and spreads the word to the degree that Jesus becomes so famous that he can't even come into the towns anymore. Because people are mobbing to get to him. They want to see this man who changed this guy, not just made him well, mind you, turned him into a bad leper. He turned him into a person who was proud and confident and joyful. Now that's healing. That's transformation. That's the good news. What the translation that I read, this one says he went out and spread it abroad. The translation I was reading the other day said he spread many things abroad. In other words, he didn't just go out and say, heal me. He went out saying the world isn't the way we thought it was. The world is different. And I know that now. God showed me that through Jesus Christ. I learned that I am somebody. I am somebody because God said so. So, what is this clean and unclean thing, and where do we find it in our culture? I think it's in lots of places. Yesterday, I meant to participate in the Marriage Equality March, and I missed it because I'm trying to not have this cold, and so I could rest up and be with you today. But I did go to the breakfast on Thursday, and it was wonderful. There were like 8 different denominations present in Vancouver celebrating. We thought, the timing of everything that went through surprised people. But anyway, I know I've told you this story before. I'm going to tell you again about my friend. She and I were in Mennonite voluntary service together, and I was so taken with how deeply spiritual she was and how compassionate she was and what a complete devotion to God and community. And then she came out to me as a lesbian. I'm young now when this happens. And I was just totally stunned. I just didn't think that was possible. I didn't think you could both be a devoted Christian and gay. I just didn't think you could. And yet I knew for a fact that she was both. So it was that moment for me, and I think many of us have had those moments, when, what we think the world is supposed to be like and what the world really is kind of comes into this collision, and you have to adjust your way of thinking. But what I want to tell you about that story is that she was, at that time, this is again 25 years ago or more, the Mennonite church that was supporting us and allowing us to do the work we were doing was not all that comfortable with this. She wanted to stay there. Most people go and do 2 years of voluntary service and then they go on and have their lives. Chris was dedicated to being in that place, and she wanted to stay there and continue to basically live in voluntary poverty and serve these people. That was her desire. And they said to her, okay, but you have to stay in the closet. Okay, but don't tell anybody who you are. And the thing is, Chris had had that conversation with Jesus. She came to him years before and asked him to heal her of this dreaded disease. And conversation with Jesus, she came to understand herself as being somebody, as being healed, as being just fine, just the way she was. And the cost of living as a second-class citizen while serving the world and the church was more than she could bear, more than she would bear.